Good morning. My name's James Danger, and I'd like to talk today about translating your andrology and embryology EQA performance into KPI tools for assessing laboratory competence. This was a talk which I'm preparing for a presentation in June in Jaipur in India for the um, Micromart Symposium on KPIs. So this talk really is, I might just make that a little bit smaller. This talk is about a common language in the laboratory. It's about every staff member describing these three blastocysts the same way, because most KPIs depend and actually require for such uniformity. Otherwise, the KPI is largely worthless. So, for instance, if you have a KPI looking at percentage A-grade blastocysts per 2PN, there are two variabilities in this. One is the quality, the variability of the blastocyst itself, and the second variability is actually how it's been described. And of course, you can use AI to give you a number, but all IVF programs are using someone to grade that embryo as a certain quality, and therefore the KPI is only of value if, in fact, the competency to assess it is correct. But in fact, it's more than this. Every client has the right to expect the same decisions to be made by all staff members. You'd be really peeved if you went in and had an embryo transferred, and your first one failed, the second one gave you a pregnancy, and the doctor said to you, well, actually, this is the better embryo. We should have transferred first. Maybe the scientist picked the wrong one out. That would send me straight to the lawyer for litigation. Now, I have created and operated on an online EQA program since 2003 at ferdaid.com. This is the QAPonlne here, that seeks to assess clinics to meet these goals. This talk is about how you can use an EQA program to monitor your clinic's competency in identifying gametes and embryos by converting them into a KPI parameter. Now, in terms of KPIs, there are already a lot of clinics using KPIs to assess competencies, but these are largely technical. For instance, the number of oocytes collected per pickup, the number of embryos, oocytes lies during ICSI, how many embryos have survived cryostorage. But most common people will say, what are the pregnancy rate per transfers for Dr. X or embryologist Y? And it could be a defined one of, say, for instance, single embryo euploid transfers, or at least super defined one of people under 35. But each time you do that, the numbers get poorer. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about competency, the ability of embryologists to say, this is a normal embryo, or this is an 4AA blastocyst, or this is a normal sperm, etc., etc. And I'm hoping to be able to transform my EQA data into KPIs. So, for instance, you could have with the andrology schemes the number of schemes submitted which are more than one standard deviation from the mean. Or you could look at individual submissions, look at the number of outliers per staff submissions for, say, blastocysts using the pooled data for the EQA as your reference material. Now, FERDAID is something which I wrote in 2002, 2003. It's been running continuously, I have to say, every day since 2003, somewhere between 50 and 300 or 400 submissions every day. There's been thousands of people through this. But it's only one. I also run on IVF data looking at publications. And of course, this video is appearing on my YouTube channel. But the EQA program looks both embryology, oocytes and embryos, both static image and time-lapse images, ultrasound, follicles and endometrium, sperm andrologies and concentration motility, etc. It's for individuals, small clinics, large clinics, multi-lab clinics, a global subscription for training and reviews, and the list goes on. It's actually quite a dynamic site, which I'm fortunately say is totally underutilized by the IVF world. But here's what it does in a nutshell. In 2026, I'm offering these schemes in andrology, in embryology, and in ultrasound. I also do some specialized schemes for some Australian clinics using a sperm motility under the SQA, where they supply the samples and distribute between the labs, and they use my EQA program to control the data, produce the reporting for NATA, which is then independent. But this is what it does. This is a 2.5-year summary of a clinic's performance, huge multi-lab clinic with many labs, but lots and lots of staff, looking at their performance in andrology over 2.5 years. And you can see here, if this clinic, the motility, these are the arrows going up and down, above and below the standard deviation mean. I'll explain that in a minute. There's normal distribution around the mean, where the group mean, saying, say their motility estimates are consistent with everybody else. Their morphologies are consistently showing a bias where they're overestimating the number of normal forms. Their concentration, they either use the hematometer or macro constant. Their assessment for sperm anti-sperm antibodies, looking at the number of sperm-bound binding beads, you would also say has ups and downs, but basically is variable, and there's no bias, nor in the halosperm assessment of sperm DNA fragmentation, or this period here would have been a bit of a worry. And the estimate of sperm vitality is basically, I would have think that there is some element of underestimating sperm vitality. But I've used the same thing for motility, which are all like percent normal forms, etc. But also for embryology, which is 4AA. They're all grades and not numbers. But ultrasound, of course, is, what is, it's a 17 millimeter follicle or a 15 millimeter endometrial thickness, etc. But I've applied the same in processing for all these different schemes. And I've done it using transferring all the data into what's called Levi-Jennings charts. Now, you may be aware, if I ask AI, if I ask, I just need to make that a bit smaller. I do apologize. I don't want to make myself look too important. There's two ways. So I ask AI how you can do a quality control graph. There's a SOHART control chart, which is like this one, where it takes a value and you plot it, the value each time period in relationship to the mean standard deviation. And but that chart will vary between what the parameters are. The other way is to everything by standard deviation from the mean, where by definition 60% of your samples will lie within one standard deviation of the group mean. And you compare your performance amongst the group. And this is consistent. So you use the same chart system for all these different schemes. You've got Levi-Jennings charts, and your plot every dot is within standard deviation for the mean. So the ones with the arrows show you just one. There's one standard deviation above, within one standard deviation of the mean above, or one standard below. The yellow is more than 1 to 2 standard deviations above or below the mean. Red is 2 to 3 standard deviations of the mean, and black is above 3 standard. So you can quickly look at this, and blue tells you everything is under control. A few little yellow dots here and there tell you that there are some schemes which are a bit of a worry, but you would be in one page, you can demonstrate to your senior management that in fact your laboratory is relatively under control. So I've applied the same thing to all these different schemes. There's a lot of visual assessments in IVF, but you can distill all things down to a common tool. What I've done is reduce all these different schemes, percent motility, morphology, concentration, binding, vitality, DNA damage, what I've created a scoring system, a particular algorithm to convert all these different things into an embryo score. And they all have a common numeric question. Now, how these are used, of course, are variable. Some are used for ranking and making decisions, but there are no critical ones. There are no life and death ones. But some decisions, like for instance, sperm morphology, will change whether someone has IVF or ICSI. So how this has worked. Now, this slide's meant to wake you up, get back on your chair, because in one summary, I'm telling you how I've created IVF, how FERDO works. Each year, I produce a number of schemes, and each scheme is exactly the same. They have one release a month, and each asks the same set of questions, but I provide different images. The images can be videos and single file or animated GIF files, and each scheme has a whole series of questions, but there's always one question, which is the calculator score, the QAP one, which is this one, a pro-nuclear score. So each staff what you basically do is a clinic will enroll in, say, the pro-nuclear scheme. They'll pay the subscription. They will enroll a certain number of staff in this as professionals or students. And each student then will go through and complete these tasks for each month, and they will get a score. And usually the higher score, the better. So for pro-nuclear, this is probably a little bit blurry. It doesn't translate as well as I'd hope. There's a series of questions using Lynn Scott's assessment for pronucleate. Lynn Scott, who's a brilliant embryologist, passed away some years ago. In the 1900s, in the 1990s, I should say, she developed this scheme for grading pronuclear stage embryos, basically the size of the pronuclei relative to each other, and the location and number of micronuclei. So for each of these questions, I put a value which is 1, and each question will rank. So the ones with the sites pronuclei, if they're equal and multiple value of 10, but if they're not the value ones, you answer each of these questions, and then you add up the score and you get a number, which is the embryo score. And basically, there's a picture of a pronuclear embryo, you answer all the questions, and what you do is you generate a score out of 100. So in this case, it's a score of 77. The higher the score, the better quality. But each one of these questions, you can go back as an individual and look at how your answer compares with everybody else. In this case, the juxtaposition of pronuclei, this embryologist agreed with 75% of everyone else who also said they were strongly together. But look, there are some people that actually don't see that. It really makes you wonder. So that's all these questions. You can see how you agree or disagree, but you end up with a score. And that score is ranked in standard deviation mean. So in this case, the mean was 71.8, range 58 to 85. Your score of 77 was 0.7 standard deviations below the mean. And if you look at each scheme for each release for the whole year, this is your answer down here, and you can see that over 12 months, this individual has by and large produced a score which is consistent with everybody else. But there are a few little red, yellow dots here, which suggesting in some way she has a tendency to overestimate the quality of the pronuclei. But what you can do as a clinic, you can go through and collect all those different submissions. So in this case, this was Clinic X. There were 17 members in this clinic. This one had about 5 labs, with 2 or 3 each in each lab. There were 30 people in the whole scheme, so it's not an awful lot. Not a lot of people do pronuclear scheming, but they should because it's important, but that's another issue. So this clinic, there were 17 submissions, and their mean value was 71.1 compared to a mean of 78. So the group's performance is 0.1 standard deviations below from the overall group mean. And I know there's a lot of different ways and criticism of this, but I'll just push that to one side and move on. But over the whole year, for the 12 releases for the year for 2021, this is the clinic's performance. These are the number of releases which position standard deviation from this. So you can see they're all between 1 and -1 standard deviations. And this is the sort of plot that you would get. This sort of distribution, they're just above and below the mean, is reflected in something like this: arrows up, arrows down. You do the same thing for blastocysts, but it's not as good. Here, there's only fewer questions and but a lot more diversity. So in this case, for instance, you asked these are Dave Gardner schemes. What stage has it developed? Describe the inner cell mass or trophectoderm. And I've added another time-dependent question: is this rate development normal or fast? What is the rate of development for this? I would have given it an embryo. I would have said it was like 96 hours or 120 hours or 220 hours or 5,000 hours, whatever. But you have to make a decision whether it's going fast or slow. And these are the different grades that Dave Gardner has. I'm not giving them each a different score, multiplied by 40, and here the calculation for 4AA will be stage 7, calculated value of 4, which gives you 28. The inner cell mass was grade 5, tightly packed. Multiply that by 4, give you 20. You add them all up, and you get a score of 88. Very simple, boom, boom, boom. And in fact, this system, even though I haven't published it, this system could be used universally as a tool for computing the value of a blastocyst without having to use AI. You could just apply this into your own internal systems and create an embryo score based on how people think. The trouble is that for, say, pronuclear grading, you get a nice normal distribution because you have a lot of choices with a lot of different options. The problem with Dave Gardner's scheme is that there's only 2 or 3 criteria: the size of the blastocyst, the inner cell mass, trophectoderm, the rate is dividing, and there's not enough options to give you firm discriminators. And this is one reason why I think AI and time-lapse can contribute to the subtlety in scoring systems, except we can't see, for instance, cytoplasmic strings or the alignment of pronuclei when they divide, etc. But that's another story. As an individual, they can look at a blastocyst and they can answer the questions and they can get a score. But what you can, as an individual, you can also go back and look at your performance over the last, I think it's like 20, 24 or so submissions over time, and seeing whether your scoring system is going up and down. I would say that over time, this person has started to grade embryos harsher than before. But you can also go back and look at the whether there's bias between poor quality embryos, the score of 42, and the high scoring embryos, and you can see there is no bias. So this change in grading system over time is more a reflection of me putting more poor quality embryos up rather than good quality. But you can also go back and look at everyone has graded it, and everyone 4A, 4AB, so you can see visually how people are graded. You can produce a report based on your performance, so a certificate, but you can also produce an annual summary of your performance month by month. And you would have to say, looking at this plus and below the mean, that you are assessing embryos in roughly a consistent way with everybody else. But there is a slight tendency to maybe assess blastocysts more harshly than other people. But you can also go back for each year and look at how you've graded the development, the inner cell mass, or the trophectoderm for each of the 12 questions. And you can basically see a performance, but you can also get a percent agreement. So 75%, 85%, 73%. So you're agreeing, this person is agreeing with about 75% of other people doing the course. And I've also, just one last, I've also introduced quite a few years ago, a grading system. And I wish I'd spent more time on this, but basically it shows a number of blastocysts. This one is a time lapse, 3 or 4 videos. You run through each one, and then you're asked to rank them. Which one would you transfer first, second, third, or fourth? And then the system computes the number of videos where people is greater than 1 to 4, and then it then gives them each embryo ranking in terms of preference. And if you agree with it, then you get a score, a tally, whatever. And you can also get it, which computes to another score, which is a score out of 100. So in this case, instead of the mean being the quality, the higher the ranking, the more consistent you are. Okay, that's a long-winded talk to get to this point. How can you take this information and use it as a KPI process? As I said, as an individual scientist, completing monthly challenge can provide a continuous testing and confirmation that your assessment skills are broadly in line with others. But as a clinic, you can use their testing to confirm whether your staff are either individually or as a group are assessing embryo, sperm, or follicles in the same manner or in a more haphazard manner. In other words, which embryo selected for, say, transfer will depend upon who is on duty on a particular day. And the answer should be, if everyone's controlled, it doesn't make any difference, but if there's variability, it does. So as a supervisor, so within the pool of people inside a QAP group, there's one person that's nominated as a supervisor, and they can do lots of things. They can enroll and subscribe, look at reports, and do editing of submissions, maintenance. But the reporting generates these sorts of forms. So this is a 2.5-year EQA summary of a clinic's performance. But for any 1 year, you can look at all the different schemes, and looking at the blues and yellow marks tell you whether your clinic is performing roughly inconsistent with everybody else. You can look at it month by month, or you can look at any one particular scheme and see how you are performing with those within the group. And any one of these, you can click any one thing, you can see how it's an individual performance by all your different staff members, both professional and unprofessional. And any of these staff members, you can click on and look at how they're performing for all the different schemes for the whole year. So you can see whether, so I've had to cross out the person's name, of course. But if you be looking at blues and yellows, and I would say basically this person has fairly good performance in andrology, but is overestimating a lot of embryos in their quality. So there are 2 ways you can create KPI points from this. One is to look at each individual submission. It's a little bit like the electronic witnessing, where each iteration of a dish with a thing is a point, and it's either consistent or not consistent with what's going on. You can use each submission as a data point, a KPI data point. And so you can look at, for instance, each month, how many submissions have been made which are within one standard deviation of the mean or outliers. So in this case, There's 12 staff submissions, of which 8 are within 1 standard deviations. But consider I've allocated some of these to be students or in training. In reality, it's 8 out of 10. But you could also turn around as a clinic and look at as a KPI the clinic's performance, and you say for each month, that's 1 point you're either within 1 standard deviation or you're not, and over the whole year you would do 12 points. So, so in this case, there would be 12 KPI points, of which 11 have passed and 1 has failed. So there's 1 out of 12 outside 1 standard deviation. But if, for instance, you're enrolled in 10 schemes, you may be able to demonstrate that 9 schemes are in control, etc. There's a lot of different ways you could use this data to create a KPI program, and I'm leaving it up to you to do that at the moment. But just remember, you're able, for any 1 point which you're not happy with, you can go back and click on a month and look at the performance, and anyway you can click on and you can see how they have generated their score, and you can then make a decision whether you want to include or not include each individual score. So just going back to an individual performance, so you can use this for accreditation or for annual assessments, but you can also use it for individual KPIs. You can get a summary of an individual performance of anyone in your staff over the whole year, year by year by year, by scheme by scheme by scheme, whichever you want to do. And you're basically looking for blues and yellows. If they're blues, round about the centre, you know that their data is relatively consistent with everybody else. But where there's lots of yellows, for instance, pronuclear scoring for this person for this year, 2025, I would say they are overestimating the pronuclear grade. But once again, you can click it as a individual to get the individual data points, or you could look at it as a group. Now, I just need to spend a couple of times looking at the sample variability, look at the sperm morphology. These are 4 schemes that were issued in 2020, and you can see that there's a normal distribution of answers, this percent normal forms, and a couple of key points. First is that in all of these cases, there are some people that are making decisions on sperm morphology which is less than 4%. So if a staff member was treating this as a 1-person sample and they were here, you would be grading them as unsuitable for IVF and they'd be going to ICSI. But I also make to if you go back and do a box and Wix's plot, most of the variability is people who are overestimating morphology. And so you actually have a bias which is dragging the percent normal higher, which is actually making more of these abnormal. But what FERDATE does is get rid of all these outliers. It always trims their means by 10%. And therefore, one, you have to recognize that there is a consequence in some of these cases. Poor quality of blasters will be discarded if you, whatever. And for morphology, what's interesting is that if I have done a thing where I have 150 odd sperm, I've asked people to assess it whether it's normal or not. And when sperm are really abnormal, from nearly everyone agrees that an abnormal sperm is bad. But as the sperm quality gets better, then there's increasing divergence in people's views. Some critical point round about here where nearly everyone, half the people agree sperm is normal or not normal. And then as sperm quality gets better, there's more and more agreement that a sperm is good. So if you look at the distribution of sperm, there are a whole lot of sperm which everyone would agree was abnormal. There are some sperm which nearly everyone would agree is normal, but there's never 100%. But there's a whole group in the middle where there's a lot of difference of opinion in how you assert it. It's got to do with maybe the thickness of the midpiece or the anterior shape of the head. There's a lot of divergence. And even now I've been doing IVF for 50 years and I'm still not very good at it. I think WHO standard has got a lot of flaws in its definitions. But so for any one sample, the variability of the sample will really depend on how people assess quite a complex and confusing set of criteria. So the WHO manual for sperm morphology, talking about the head, is a really confusing way to interpret a visual thing. So if you have a sample with a lot of these funny sort of marginal sperm, you're going to get a lot more variability, which isn't due to it demonstrates people's inability to be consistent in applying a standard which is really vague in the first place. So you need to take some care when you're looking at assessing people's performance, because for some samples, there will be a far higher variability The sad thing for those sort of people is, because I'm using standard deviation as the mean, if you are an outlier, you will always be an outlier. So, and I just think the sample variability is a really important point. So in any assessment, there will be some parameters that everyone will agree on, like for AA, a blastocyst with a really big cell mass, where it's just starting to hatch out, and there's lots and lots of trifecta, and nearly everyone will say that's a 5AA, right? Or if something is really expanded and with lots and lots of trifecta cells and a big ball of cells clearly visible in their cell mass, nearly everyone will agree that's a 5AA. But where the number of cells around the trifectoderm is variable, sometimes you have embryos where the cells trifectoderm, there's more numerals on one side than another. People will vary in whether that's an A or a B, because Gardner's scheme is too vague. And if the scheme is vague, you're going to get diversity. So some excuse me, some releases will have far more variability to it. And that's one reason why you want to be using Levi Jennings, just to only ever looking at where you are in the spread. So if there's a big variability, there's and if you are if you're an outlier, then you're still an outlier. And likewise with fragmentation is another one. Nearly everyone will define an embryo with no fragmentation because it's self-evident. But the more fragmentation there is, the more variability is. And so when you're using a KPI program where you have to show embryos with various degrees of fragmentation, there will be more and more variability to it. And you need to take that into account when people are listed as outliers. So how can you use this data as part of a KPI program? Almost finished. On a monthly basis, you could record the number of schemes where the number of clinic performances were within one to two, two to three, or above two standard deviations mean. Or you could record the number of professional replies to a scheme that you were subscribed to as being within one standard deviation, etc. FED-A provides this information in summary sections, but to date, and I regret not having done it, written a specific KPI report. So just click one button. And I may go back and do that. But really, I think I prefer this looking at individual performance rather than group performance. And I see it very similar to the witnessing monitoring KPI program, where each time you put a dish on a plate, that's an instance, and then you have to check whether that agrees with the patient you're thinking of. And just remember, if I'm using standard deviation mean, by definition, there will always be outliers. So here are some theoretical data before I finish. So this is a clinic, big clinic. They enroll in 12 schemes a year. So there's 12 tests each month. And then you can look at whether the group as a whole was within one standard deviation of the mean. So I said, in this case, there were 12 schemes and 10 of those were in one standard deviation. So let's say you have 10 schemes and you count them all up. And you can say, how many of those were compliant? Well, there will be 10 out of 12 were compliant. And you can produce this graph. You can create a benchmark of, say, 90%, whichever you like. Then create a shareable chart that looks at their performance year by year. This is hypothetical data, which I've done just to create it. And so it's looking at the standard deviation around the mean, but relative to the actual value. And you would basically say everyone is compliant. But this month, there was something funny going on that you may want to tag as an outlier. Or you could present it as a Levi-Jennings chart, which is basically like everything else, is looking at the spread. The good thing about Levi-Jennings is that you can look at the spread and look at the variability between different schemes and looking at it the same way, but will also highlight clearly when you are more than one or two standard deviations from this. This is 2.2 standard deviation below the mean and does warrant you to create an incident form for it. And of course, you want to get really funny, which I think you need to. You can start to do it both by, instead of doing the whole lot, you used to do andrology and embryology, and you get more complex charts, which I would actually do a separate chart. So I just did this for this talk. But also you could go back and look at Vinchman, and I think this is the one that I prefer. So this clinic, there are 12 schemes. There's 12 tests every month, 1 month. You have 15 staff members, which rise over 2 years to 26. So you can calculate the number of submissions you would expect. And then you look for how many of those were within one standard deviation of the mean. I just basically made these up to give you a spread. And by definition, these are the ones with more standard deviation. These are compliant. and non-compliant, and then you can print this out as a shareable chart looking at variations around your benchmark, and you can also plot the number of activities. So you can look at the staff numbers, and you can say here that when you increase the staff numbers from 15 to 21, that in fact there was no difference in your ability, but when you went from 21 to 26, there was a drop, in which that you then had to address. And so you could mark this as an outlier, but you could also just go back and look at the same performance if you were a small clinic. So a small clinic, you might enroll in a couple of schemes and have 2 or 3 staff members, and you get a lower number of activity. But once again, you can still go back and look at how many of those were within 1 standard deviation of mean, look at whether they're compliant or not, and still produce the same KPI chart, right? So, and so, um, in other words, the data holds up regardless of either a big clinic or a small clinic. So I've almost got to the end. Does this make a difference? Well, in some ways, it's really important. In some ways, not. You could, a cynic would say it really only affects embryo transfer, but nearly all cumulative pregnancy rates show the same outcome for IVF for ICSI day 3 day 5, plus or minus PGT. So who cares? You put the best embryo back, but it's not. We'll put the second one back, but basically the woman will still fall pregnant, whether it's the first or last transfer from a pickup. But it does matter, of course, when you're doing things, you have to recognise that age is the only delimiter in the outcome, but there may be able to influence the miscarriage rate, and poor embryos will still give you a pregnancy, but it's not as many. So it does make a difference. But if you actually are if your group as a whole is fairly efficient in grading embryos the same way, you would anticipate your clinic would have time to first pregnancy would be lower, and there may actually be fewer miscarriages because you're actually putting back euploid embryos. So if you have a really good time to pregnancy and low miscarriage rate, it could be because you have good embryos, of course, but also all your staff are picking out the best embryos for transfer. But poor quality embryos will clog up your cryochloride system with little hope of a baby. And if you have poor variability between your staff, you can have embryos of varying quality being shoved into your cryo system, and they'll basically be there for 12 years. And there's also a case where embryos will be discarded, will vary between staff. But more importantly, there's a universal language between staff. A 4AA is a 4AA is a 4AA. And no matter if you're different laboratory or different clinics, or over time, a 4AA is still a 4AA. But if you're doing that for research or for KPI, the more consistent everybody is, the tighter that stuff that is. If you go back and look at that blastocyst scheme I show you where everyone's writing different answers, it's horrifying to see that people are grading the same blastocyst differently. And I'd just like to finish up a little bit on comparing AI to doing manual grading. This, of course, is the great debate going on in IVF at the moment. With AI, for instance, it's actually pretty good. It's really only using to predict implantation potential and not necessarily for decisions for biopsy or whatever, or discarding. It tries to predict the euploidy and is currently used as a support tool in decision making. But one of the problems, of course, is multiple the proprietary version. So one score for one clinic isn't the same as another. And it's been untested yet in legal environments. If someone's using AI numbers to put embryos back, someone is going to see something wrong with that and sue you. Manual grading, though, has the pluses and minuses. The aim is to be consistent between staff. So you can have 2 embryos with the same score, but the embryo AI system may be using different tools to get that. Actually, I don't know that much about AI in all fairness. In fact, no one does. So no one knows what the black box is doing, quite frankly. But for manual grading, the aim is to be consistent between staff. The aim is to ensure all clients get the same embryo. The aim is for the description to be uniform and allows decisions on each embryo to be consistent between what staff and members are on duty any one day. Allows all clients' workup and review to be the same. People being committed to IVF and ICSI based on one morphology score is really, really bad. But does allow you to collect as a KPI data. key index. It does allow me to be published for its meaningful, but importantly, it's a universal language between clinics and staff. So my final comments about experience with QAPonlne. Most clinics use this for accreditation purposes and not as a quality and training exercise. Yet gamete and embryo grading are at the very core of IVF. There is this. Some clinics that have used QAPonlne have found that the supervisor tool was a really great way of dealing with a lot of complex stuff, which takes a lot of time, but can easily be processed and looked at as the supervisor. But lab staff often find it time consuming and burdensome if they're enrolled in too many schemes. The key, I think, is to engage staff into why they made decisions and to prompt them, and that there's a clinic desire for all staff to make the same decision. And using QAP can really enforce your desire to do that. We do need to recognise that staff skills do drift over time as their experience grows. How can a KPI such as percent good quality blastocysts mean anything at all unless everyone is describing it the same way? So I'd like to thank you. I know that IVF is a personal journey and that this involves the actions of many people, many techniques, many options. And one of those is embryo grading. I hope this helps in your journey helps you understand all aspects of the journey. If you like what I'm doing, press like. At that point in time, I think I'd like to stop and say thank you for listening. Goodbye.